Have you ever wondered why almost every major civilization in human history eventually created kings? Egypt had pharaohs, Mesopotamia had kings, China developed dynasties, the Maya built powerful royal cities. Across completely different continents, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, humans kept creating remarkably similar systems of power. But here's the strange part. For most of human history, there were no kings at all. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in relatively small communities where no single person controlled an entire population. So what happened? How did humanity go from small groups of people sharing resources to enormous kingdoms ruled by a single family? The answer begins long before the first crown was ever placed on a human head. Imagine living 12,000 years ago. There are no cities, no palaces, no armies, and no government offices. Your community moves across the landscape looking for food. If animals disappear, you move somewhere else. If the weather becomes dangerous, you search for a better place. Leadership exists, but it is usually temporary. A skilled hunter might earn respect, an experienced elder might influence decisions, but influence is not the same thing as permanent power. If people disagree with a leader, they can often leave. Geography itself limits authority. You cannot easily rule people who can simply walk away. Then, something happened that changed the relationship between humans and the land. Agriculture began spreading in different parts of the world. People learned to cultivate plants and domesticate animals. Instead of constantly moving toward food, communities could remain in one location and produce food themselves. At first, this looked like freedom from nature, but it also created something new: property. A field could be planted, harvested, stored, and defended. A herd could grow. A granary could hold enough grain to feed hundreds of people. For the first time, wealth could stay in one place. And once wealth had an address, power could have an address too. A hunter-gatherer could carry most of their important possessions with them. A farmer couldn't easily carry an entire field. They were tied to the land. That changed the balance of power. Whoever controlled productive land, water, animals, storage facilities, and food supplies could influence everyone who depended on them. The first rulers probably didn't wake up one morning and announce that they were kings. Power accumulated gradually. Someone organized irrigation, someone protected the village, someone controlled a storehouse, someone settled disputes, someone became responsible for religious ceremonies. Each responsibility created another reason for people to depend on that person. Then villages became larger, and larger communities created problems that small communities had never experienced. If a village contains 20 families, everyone can probably know everyone else. But what happens when there are thousands of people? Who decides where the water goes? Who organizes the harvest? Who resolves conflicts between strangers? Who protects the food stores? Who builds walls when enemies appear? Cooperation becomes harder as population increases, and that creates an opportunity for permanent authority. One of the earliest places where this transformation became visible was southern Mesopotamia. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, agricultural communities grew into some of the world's first cities. Uruk became enormous by ancient standards, bringing together tens of thousands of people. It needed administrators, workers, builders, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, and religious officials. Someone had to coordinate all of them. The city could no longer function entirely through informal relationships. It needed institutions. This is where an important transformation happened. Authority became organized. Instead of one respected individual temporarily leading a group, societies began developing offices and positions that could continue even after the individual died. The person could disappear, but the institution remained. That is one of the most important steps in the creation of government. Power stopped belonging only to a person and began belonging to a position. But there was another problem. Why should everyone obey? Force was one answer, but force is expensive. A ruler who needs soldiers standing beside every farmer cannot govern efficiently. The more powerful solution was belief. Ancient rulers often connected their authority to religion. They were described as chosen by the gods, protected by the gods, or even descended from divine beings. This wasn't simply superstition. Religion provided a powerful explanation for why one person or family should possess authority over thousands or millions of others. Imagine two rulers. The first says, "I am stronger than you, so obey me." The second says, "The gods have chosen me to maintain order, protect the land, and preserve the world." Which message is easier to build a civilization around? The second one. Belief reduces the amount of force required to maintain power. If people believe the political system is part of the natural or sacred order, they may obey even when the ruler isn't physically present. This is why ancient kings surrounded themselves with symbols. Crowns, elaborate clothing, giant monuments, ceremonial weapons, temples, statues, and royal palaces all communicated the same message. This person is different. The ruler wasn't simply another farmer standing in a field. The ruler represented the state, the gods, the army, and the stability of society itself. Political power became theater, and the theater was incredibly effective. But kings needed more than belief. They needed resources. Armies don't fight for free. Roads don't build themselves. Palaces don't construct themselves. Administrators need food. So governments developed systems of taxation. Farmers produced grain, and a portion was collected by the state. Livestock could be counted. Labor could be demanded. Goods could be stored in central warehouses. The government transformed agricultural surplus into political power. This created a remarkable cycle. More food allowed a larger population. A larger population created more workers. More workers created larger cities. Larger cities generated more taxes. More taxes supported larger armies. Larger armies allowed rulers to control more territory. More territory brought access to more resources, and those resources strengthened the ruler even further. Political power had become self-reinforcing. But there was a darker side. The same system that created organized civilization also created organized inequality. Once a permanent ruling class existed, society could become divided into layers. At the top were kings, royal families, priests, and high officials. Beneath them were soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, and administrators. At the bottom were farmers, laborers, servants, and enslaved people in some societies. The exact structure differed from civilization to civilization, but the basic pattern appeared repeatedly. Control over resources created control over people. And then came war. When neighboring cities competed for land, water, trade routes, and resources, rulers discovered that organized violence could increase their wealth. A successful army could capture territory, livestock, precious metals, and labor. Victory could make a king richer and more powerful. This encouraged further expansion. Eventually, small kingdoms began competing with other kingdoms, and the strongest rulers created empires. Egypt provides one of the clearest examples of how political and religious power could merge. The pharaoh was not simply a political administrator. The pharaoh was deeply connected to the religious order of Egyptian society. Massive monuments communicated the ruler's power across generations. The Great Pyramid, for example, required extraordinary organization of labor, materials, transportation, and food. Whatever else it represented, it demonstrated something unmistakable. The state could mobilize enormous human resources around the authority of a single ruler. But power has a dangerous weakness. It creates competition. If one family controls wealth, land, and political authority, other powerful people naturally want access to the same resources. This means kings constantly have to manage nobles, priests, generals, merchants, and relatives. A king may appear to rule alone, but behind the throne is an enormous network of people whose loyalty must be maintained. This is why succession became one of the greatest dangers to ancient kingdoms. A powerful ruler could keep the system together for decades, but what happened after that ruler died? If there was a clear successor, the transition might be peaceful. If several people claimed the throne, the result could be civil war. Brothers could fight brothers, generals could challenge princes, nobles could choose different sides. Sometimes an empire could lose more strength fighting itself than it ever lost fighting an external enemy. The ancient world therefore developed a powerful political idea, the dynasty. Instead of choosing a completely new ruler every generation, authority could pass through a family. The son inherited the father's position. The family became the symbol of continuity. This made government more predictable, but it also created a strange assumption that political ability could somehow be inherited through blood. Royal bloodlines became sacred in many cultures. Marriage itself could become political technology. Kings and queens married to create alliances. Families married across kingdoms to prevent wars or strengthen claims to territory. A marriage could accomplish what thousands of soldiers could not. It could turn former enemies into relatives. Eventually, kingship became so deeply connected with society that people could imagine no alternative. The state had temples, armies, taxes, laws, and traditions. The ruler sat at the center of all of them. But this doesn't mean ordinary people always loved their rulers. Ancient populations rebelled, resisted taxes, fled armies, and challenged governments, just as people have done throughout history. Power was never absolute. In fact, one of the most important discoveries about ancient political systems is that rulers were often constrained by tradition. A king could not necessarily do whatever he wanted. Priests, nobles, military leaders, local communities, religious customs, and established laws could all limit royal authority. A ruler who ignored every institution might eventually destroy the cooperation that kept the kingdom functioning. This reveals something important about power. A king is powerful because other people cooperate with the system. Farmers grow food, workers build roads, soldiers fight, administrators collect taxes, priests perform ceremonies, merchants move goods. If enough people stop cooperating, even the most impressive palace becomes powerless. That is why the history of kings is really the history of cooperation. The first kings did not control humanity simply because they were stronger than everyone else. They became powerful because they found ways to organize thousands of people around a common system. Sometimes that system was based on religion, sometimes on military strength, sometimes on economic control. Usually, it was a combination of all three. And once humans learned how to organize large populations, there was almost no going back. Kingdoms became empires. Empires created roads, writing systems, legal codes, monumental architecture, and enormous trade networks. The same political systems that created inequality also created institutions capable of coordinating projects that no small village could accomplish. This is the great paradox of early civilization. Centralized power could be oppressive, but it could also be extraordinarily productive. A king could demand labor to build a monument, but the same government could organize irrigation that prevented famine. A ruler could collect taxes, but those taxes could fund roads and defenses. A centralized state could suppress freedom, but it could also create stability across enormous territories. So when we look at the first kings, we shouldn't simply ask whether they were good or bad. We should ask why societies kept creating them. The answer is that large populations needed coordination, and coordination created opportunities for authority. Once authority became connected to wealth, religion, military power, and inheritance, it became extremely difficult to remove. Thousands of years later, we still live with many of the systems that began during this transformation. Governments still collect taxes, states still maintain armies, political leaders still use symbols and ceremonies, families still inherit wealth and influence, nations still build monuments to communicate power, and people still debate the same fundamental question that ancient societies faced: who should have the right to make decisions for everyone else? Perhaps the most surprising lesson is that kings were not simply invented by ambitious individuals. They emerged from a world becoming too large and complicated for small group leadership to handle. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus created property. Property created inequality. Inequality created competition. Competition created organized authority. Authority created government, and government created rulers who could transform personal influence into permanent political power. The first king may have worn a crown, but the crown itself wasn't the real source of his power. The real power came from the thousands of people who produced the food, built the walls, followed the laws, fought the wars, and believed that the system had a purpose. And perhaps that is the most important lesson hidden in the story of the first kings. Power doesn't begin when someone sits on a throne. Power begins when other people accept that the person on the throne has the right to make decisions for them. The crown is only the symbol. The real kingdom exists inside the minds of the people who believe it exists.